Um, I just want to pop in to talk a little bit about kind of continuing some of our discussion about like theoretical frames and approaches in the humanities, and how you might make use of those for Project 3. But before we do that, I do want to kind of offer a little bit of a reminder about the Google Drive folders that have been set up for each of your groups. So you want to make sure that you have access to that. And as you're working on your project charter, right, all of your assignments that are collaborative, which is going to be the vast majority of them for Project 3, you're going to want to submit in this way. So in this case, you're going to upload it to the group folder. So if you're in group 1, upload the assignment to that folder, and then have one person kind of send me an email as part of your submission, right? So make sure that everybody has access to this. And if you're having any issues with that at all, just don't hesitate to send me an email and let me know. But beyond that, I kind of just want to jump into a little bit of what we were starting to touch on in our last class, which has to do with the fact that like interpretation in the humanities is often very, very messy, right? You have multiple people who are kind of approaching one singular text, and you're likely going to be reading it in different ways. There are often multiple messages that are kind of embedded in film. And you might even, as like a singular viewer, come up with like contradicting interpretations, or maybe across group members, you'll have different kind of ideas. And so it's never going to be like a one size fits all, right? And so my concern definitely does have to do with like you being able to draw on evidence that defends your particular interpretation, the stance that you basically identify in your thesis statement. But I also encourage you to think about this kind of messiness that comes with interpretation as you're collaborating with your other group members to kind of outline your thesis statement for this project. As you're watching your film, there are ways that you can kind of use questions as like a generative tool to help you come up with ideas about what it is that you might take away as like a kind of social critique or commentary that the film is making. So you could ask, what is present in the text, right? What kinds of colors are being used? What kinds of lighting do you see? What camera angles? Are there symbols that you identify as recurring? Those kinds of things. What kind of music is being used? I mean, the list kind of goes on, and you could really think about like what kinds of rhetorical features of any kind are present. And then you can additionally think about like how the text is creating meaning, right? How are the strategies that you're identifying being employed to add in some way to the meaning that you see in the text? And you have to think about why the text is set up in the way that it is. Why is this particular color present? How is it being used to maybe convey some kind of emotion or attitude, or create some kind of like setting or ambiance for the viewers? So you can see how these questions give you a lot of kind of jumping off points for starting to think about the text in a lot of different ways. So as you're thinking about like visual analysis, and which is a very different kind of approach than the work that we were doing in Project 2, right? Where in some cases you were doing visual analysis thinking about the structure of the two articles. Are they using charts or, fun images that are meant to bring in the viewer? But a lot of what we were doing was looking at things like language use and the kinds of citations. It felt very textual, I would say. Whereas in this case, you're going to be leaning a lot more on visual analysis, thinking about those things like color and camera angles and so on and so forth. And so the first thing that I would recommend to you is to make observations. We're going to have an assignment coming up, I believe, early next week, where you're going to watch your film and take lots and lots of notes. And I want you to, I mean it when I say take lots of notes. Make notes of all kinds of different things. Think about when you see different scenes, maybe things that are similar between them or different, right? Are there like contrasts that are being built out in the film? Sometimes you'll have films that switch between different kinds of colors to convey different things in different places and at different times. Again, think about like just questions that kind of help you generate ideas. So as you're watching, you can think about like, well, what does the film make me feel or think about as I'm watching it? And why do I feel that way? Right? Am I noticing as I'm watching a scary movie, right, that I'm starting to feel kind of frightened? Right? Well, what kinds of things are doing that? Well, it's probably dark lighting, right? There might be some kind of sound effect or creepy music that's playing in the background. And you can see how, as you're sitting there and you're actually experiencing it as the viewer, you can kind of stop and think for a moment, like, why do I feel that way? What are they doing there to kind of produce that emotion? And the big question here is like, what is the text making readers think or feel about any kind of like social theme? So this could have to do with gender or race or class, right? Is it making some kind of commentary on this? And again, remember with the stance, right? The idea here is that they're conveying an idea that something should or shouldn't be a particular way, right? Being non-neutral about it. So why are we touching on issues of identity and social and cultural and political issues? Well, the answer to that is because we are in the humanities. And these are issues that a lot of humanities researchers have concerns about. So, like I said before, it's kind of built into the name, right? Scholars in the humanities are analyzing and observing human thought, their creativity, their lived experience. And so what they'll do in order to kind of understand human experience is interrogate these texts that are being produced out of human societies and cultures. So in this case, we're looking at film as one example of that. And when we're doing that, in order to identify like a social stance or a commentary that's being conveyed, very often scholars will draw on like specific theories that help them interpret the meaning that they're picking up on in the text. And there are lots and lots of ways that you can do this, but this is a paper that I wrote in my first semester of graduate school. I was in a literature class, and I was reading two different books. I was reading William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, and then Ward's Salvage the Bones. And there's some connections between them because they are both set in Mississippi. And so I was looking at that. And here I'm drawing on something called epistemologies of crisis, which is like a very, very fancy way of talking about like the way that people respond to and think about and experience natural disasters, right? But this was a theoretical framework that I had come across as I was, just doing readings on this topic and trying to figure out a way that I could analyze these two texts and compare them to one another. And so when I found this framework, it kind of occurred to me like, oh, this kind of is talking about what I'm noticing in these two books. And so then I was able to bring it in as a framework or a lens to kind of understand basically similarities, differences between the two. There are lots and lots of different frameworks that are, oh my goodness, that's not what I meant to do. Okay. Lots and lots of different kinds of frameworks that are out there. We have already been looking at rhetorical analysis as a particular kind of framework for looking at and understanding a text, right? You could take a feminist approach to a text and look at something like intersectionality theory, right? Understanding how different kind of facets of a person's identity are inherently linked and shape their experience of the world, right? So you can see that there's like lots and lots of things that are out there. And as we're thinking about your secondary sources for Project 3, I think that this is one of the functions that those sources can serve, right? You can use them to kind of talk about the rhetorical strategies that you're interested in, right? You can bring in a source about camera angles, about color in film and those kinds of things. But you also could bring in a source that is kind of outlining a theoretical framework that you want to use to support your interpretation of a text. So why are we kind of bringing ourselves into our research and writing, or what do we mean by this? So this is something that you're not going to be like writing for this project, but I wanted to point it out because I think it's interesting to think about in terms of humanities research in particular, because we're all humans out in the world. We're all kind of coming from different lived experiences and backgrounds. And something that is becoming increasingly common in both humanities and social sciences research is to list like positionality statements. Basically, these are statements within a text where the author kind of explains who they are, where they come from, And so this is a positionality statement that I think is very representative of why these are important, where this scholar, Kelly Wright, she's a Black woman. She was talking about a study where she was looking at issues of racism and housing discrimination. And so she was like calling people in her area and was kind of like analyzing the responses that she would get depending on whether or not they identified her as Black over the phone. And she talked about how, as a Black woman, like doing that kind of work, you can imagine the kind of emotional toll that labor, that kind of labor and research poses, right? Where if you come from that background, it kind of like hits a little closer to home. And the main reason I wanted to bring this up is because although you're not writing one of these positionality statements for this project, I wanted to kind of show you that people are doing this in their work, because I want you to think about your own identity and background and the way that responds to the way that you approach a text, right? Thinking about your role as the audience. And especially because you're working in a group, in the same way that you're probably going to have a lot of different interpretations. A big part of why that is because you're coming from all different backgrounds and experiences and things like that. And that is definitely a big kind of core value, in the same way that we talked about things like recency and objectivity as being important to researchers in the natural sciences. For humanists, understanding how a humanities researcher, like how their lived experience and background shapes their interpretation of a text is really important. That's something that we value, is kind of transparently understanding the relationship between those two things. So I want you to really kind of think about this as you're developing your central argument in your thesis statement for Project 3. So yeah, again, we're just thinking about the rhetorical situation for the text, and y'all are all different audiences that come from different places when you're watching a film, but also like that's going to shape you as the author of your thesis statement and the kind of interpretations that you bring to that. Okay. So with that said, the assignment for today is that perusal reading, and it asks you to kind of think about the intentional choices that are being made by the like directors and producers and what have you as the author of a film. Okay. So if you have any questions on that, feel free to email me and let me know. But otherwise, I will see you at our next in-person class.